Hey, there's a guy who used to post on hiking forums under a trail name he won't use anymore, and he told rangers something that never made it into any official report. He said he found his own boot prints in the mud, walking toward him, on a section of trail that doesn't loop back for 6 miles. He hadn't turned around. He hadn't doubled back. The prints matched his tread exactly, sunk deep, like someone his exact weight had been standing there minutes before he arrived. He made it off that mountain by morning. He has never hiked north of that gap again. To understand why, you have to go back to the evening he signed a shelter log he never should have opened. His trail name was Whistlepig, and he picked it up in Georgia during the first week of his section hike. The kind of name that gets handed to you by strangers around a fire because you made a joke about groundhogs on day 2, and it stuck harder than you wanted it to. He was 31, recently split from a woman he'd been with since college, and he'd told his sister the trail was about clearing his head, not about anything dramatic. That part was true. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't looking for anything either. He just wanted quiet, mileage, and enough physical exhaustion that his brain would stop replaying the last conversation he'd had with her. 3 days in, he reached a shelter tucked into a stand of hemlocks a half-mile off a gap most day hikers never bothered with. It was late in the season, the leaves half down, the kind of gray afternoon where the light goes flat and everything smells like wet bark. He had the data book memorized well enough by then to know the shelter slept 8, had a spring 20 yards downhill, and had a privy that smelled exactly like every other privy on the trail. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of shelter you forget the name of within a week. He got there before dark, which mattered, because he'd read enough trail journals to know you don't want to be setting up in the last light if you can help it. He filled his water at the spring, hung his bear bag from the cable system bolted between 2 trees, and ate reheated rice out of the same pot he'd used for 3 straight nights, standing up because his hips were too sore to sit on the shelter floor yet. A northbound hiker came through around 5, a guy in his 20s with a trail name he didn't catch, and they traded the usual small talk. How the last shelter's mice had gotten into somebody's food bag, how the next water source was supposedly running low. Normal stuff. The kind of conversation that happens 100 times a day somewhere on that trail. Before the other hiker headed down to fill his own water bottles, the guy pulled out the shelter register, a beat-up spiral notebook in a gallon Ziploc, tucked into a crack in the support beam where hikers kept it dry, and flipped to a blank page to sign in. He mentioned there were only a couple of entries from the past week, mostly complaints about the privy door not latching right. Whistlepig didn't think much of it. He planned to sign later, after he'd eaten the way he always did, once his hands weren't shaking from the cold. That was around 6. By 6:30, the light was mostly gone and the other hiker had gone down to the spring with his headlamp bobbing between the trees. Whistlepig had the shelter to himself for a few minutes, sitting on his sleeping pad with his journal open, writing about his hip flexors and how the rice tasted like the inside of the pot. Old shelters make noise. He knew that going in. The wood contracts in the cold, the tin roof edges tick as the temperature drops, and somewhere under the floorboard something, mice probably, scratched around like it did every night on the trail. None of that bothered him. Then something knocked twice against the support beam. Not a settling sound, not wood contracting. 2 distinct taps, evenly spaced, like knuckles on a door. He looked up, half expecting to see the other hiker back already, maybe messing with the bare cable. Nobody was there. He told himself it was a branch, or the beam settling in a new way now that the temperature had dropped further, and he went back to writing. That's the kind of detail people remember because it seems useless at the time. He didn't get up, he didn't check, most people wouldn't have. The northbound hiker came back a few minutes later, filled bottles clinking against his pack, and they ate dinner more or less in silence, both too tired to keep up conversation. Around 8, the other hiker packed it in for the night and mentioned he wanted an early start, planned to be gone before sunrise. Whistlepig said goodnight, zipped himself into his sleeping bag on the far end of the shelter floor, and lay there listening to the wind move through the hemlocks the way it does every night in the mountains. A long, low sound that rises and falls without ever really stopping. Oh, the second knock came almost an hour later, after the other hiker's breathing had gone slow and even with sleep. 2 taps again, same rhythm, same spacing, from the same support beam. Whistlepig lay still, telling himself it was the same explanation as before. Cold wood, a branch brushing the roofline, something completely ordinary that he was only noticing because he was alone with his thoughts, and it was quiet enough to hear every small sound the forest made. He almost convinced himself of that. He was good at convincing himself of things. Most people are, when the alternative is admitting they're scared of a noise. Then a voice came from just past the shelter's open front wall, low, almost gentle, and it said his trail name. Not a shout, not a question. Just his name, Whistlepig, spoken the way his hiking partner from the first week used to say it, in that same slightly teasing tone she'd always used, except she'd flown home 2 days earlier from Franklin, 140 miles south, and had no way of being anywhere near that gap. He didn't move. He didn't answer. He lay there with his eyes open in the dark, listening to his own heartbeat, telling himself it was the wind carrying some hiker's voice up from the gap below, some trick of the terrain bending sound around the ridgeline the way sound sometimes does in the mountains. It was a reasonable thought. It was almost a good enough thought to fall asleep on. The knocking stopped the instant he stopped breathing loud enough to hear it. Not gradually, not fading out the way sound does when something walks away. It simply stopped all at once, the second he went still and quiet, as if it had been listening for exactly that. That was the part that unsettled him more than the knock itself. Not that it happened, that it knew when to stop. He didn't sleep much after that. He lay there running through every reasonable explanation he could think of. An owl, a hiker talking in their sleep somewhere he couldn't see, his own exhausted brain filling in a voice out of wind and expectation. And none of them quite fit the way the sound had stopped. Explanations are supposed to make things smaller. That one didn't. By the time gray light started coming through the shelter's open wall, he'd decided the smartest thing he could do was get moving early and put miles between himself and that gap. The northbound hiker was already gone, pack and all, exactly like he'd said he would be. Whistlepig boiled water for instant coffee with hands that were colder than the morning accounted for, packed up fast, and reached for the register before he left, mostly out of habit. Through hikers sign in and out. It's just what you do, a small courtesy to whoever comes through next, a way of saying someone was here and they were fine. He flipped to the page from the night before to add his entry below the northbounders and stopped with the pen an inch off the paper. There was already a line in the spot where he was about to write. His handwriting. His exact loops on the lowercase g's. The way he always crossed his T's a little too far to the left. It described a hiker heading north through the gap. Mentioned rice for dinner, mentioned a knock on the beam he'd written off as settling wood. It was dated for that day. He hadn't written a single word of it. He told himself it was possible he'd signed in half asleep the night before and forgotten. That exhaustion does strange things to memory on long trails, that this was simpler than it felt sitting there with his coffee going cold. He almost believed it. Almost is a word that does a lot of work when you want to keep walking. He decided to hike out early instead of pushing further north like he'd planned, telling himself it wasn't the entry, it wasn't the voice, it was just fatigue, and a shorter day would do him good. That's what he told himself. It felt more like the truth was choosing which door to leave through. The trail down was steep in places, switchbacking through rhododendron thick enough to block sightlines more than 10 feet ahead, the kind of section where you hear your own boots more than you see the ground. About 2 miles down, where the trail crossed a wash of exposed mud from the previous week's rain, he stopped hard enough that his trekking poles skidded. There was a single line of boot prints coming up the trail toward him. Not beside his own tracks, not crossing them. Coming directly at him, mid-stride, sunk deep enough into the soft mud that whoever made them had to weigh close to what he did. He crouched down and matched the tread pattern against the sole of his own boot without fully deciding to do it, some part of him needing to rule it out before his brain would let him think anything else. It matched. Not similar. Matched, down to the worn edge on the left heel where he'd caught a rock outside Hiawassee 2 weeks earlier. He hadn't turned around anywhere on that stretch. The trail didn't loop back for another 6 miles according to his data book, and even if it had, there was no way for a second set of his own prints to be walking toward him on a section he hadn't crossed yet. He stood there a long moment with his heart doing something uncomfortable in his chest, then stepped carefully around the prints instead of through them, like they belonged to someone else's business, and kept moving downhill faster than his hips wanted to go. He reached the road crossing an hour later than he'd planned, shaking slightly in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and called the shuttle service listed in his guidebook from the 1 bar of signal the gap gave him. The driver who picked him up was an older man with a thermos of gas station coffee wedged in the console and a voice that didn't waste words. Somewhere on the winding drive down, making small talk about which shelters had decent water, Whistlepig mentioned, carefully, that he thought he'd found some strange prints back up near the ridge. The driver didn't ask which shelter. He said, almost offhand, that some hikers called that stretch the Register, on account of it having a reputation among the ridge runners who'd worked that section for years, that every so often someone would find an entry in the shelter log describing things that hadn't happened to them yet, dated correctly, written in their own hand. He said it the way you'd mention a pothole that's always in the same spot on a road, not like it was strange, just like it was a known thing you drove around. "You didn't write anything down about your plans up there, did you?" the driver asked. "Where you were headed after, anything like that?" Whistlepig said no, mostly out of instinct, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "Good," the driver said, and didn't explain further, and turned the radio back up like the conversation was finished. His phone had no signal for the last 4 miles down into town, and by the time he got a single bar back at the trailhead parking lot, he had 1 voicemail from his sister and nothing else. No explanation waiting for him. Nothing that made the morning make more sense. He checked his data book against the mileage 1 more time out of some need to prove the 6 miles were real, and they were. 6 miles of trail he hadn't walked yet, and prints matching his boots walking toward him from that direction anyway. He never told anyone the last part, not even the shuttle driver. Before he closed the register that morning, back at the shelter, he'd flipped 1 page further out of a compulsion he still can't fully explain, and found 1 more line in his own handwriting. It described him arriving at this exact trailhead, the exact color of the shuttle van, the exact thermos on the dashboard, written down 3 hours before any of it happened. He got in the van, went to town, resupplied, and never signed a physical shelter register again for the rest of that hike, printing his entries on scraps of paper instead and folding them into his pocket like that made a difference. He still doesn't have an answer for how the words got there before he wrote them. he has decided he doesn't want one. The next account comes from a ridge runner who spent 6 seasons walking that same stretch of trail for a living, and who learned the hard way that some of what gets cleared off that mountain isn't cleared by anyone on the payroll. Her name doesn't matter for this one. She asked that it not be used, and the district she worked for is still active, so we'll just call her what her hiking partners did that season: Birdie. She'd been a ridge runner for 6 years by the time this happened, which meant she knew that stretch of trail better than most people know their own street. She could tell you which water sources ran low in a dry August, which shelters flooded in a hard rain, which switchbacks iced first in November. She wasn't the kind of person who spooked easily. 6 seasons of solo hiking through fog, black bear encounters, and hikers having medical emergencies miles from a road will do that to you. She'd seen enough real danger that she didn't have much patience left over for imagined danger. That fall had brought one of the worst wind events the district had seen in years. A storm system that came through hard enough to take down full stands of hemlock across 3 different sections of trail. Birdie spent most of that week doing exactly what her job required: hiking sections with a chainsaw strapped to her pack, clearing blowdowns, checking blaze paint that had gotten scorched or knocked loose, radioing updates back to the district office so day hikers could be warned about closures. It was physical, unglamorous work, and she was good at it. On a Tuesday, a hiker radioed in a large blowdown, blocking the trail near the same gap where Whistlepig had spent his strange night 3 seasons earlier. Not that Birdie knew that story yet, or would for some time. The report described a full oak down across the trail, impossible to step over, requiring a full reroute. Birdie logged the coordinates, checked her map against the GPS waypoint the hiker had given, and set out early the next morning to clear it before the weekend traffic came through. When she got there, the tree wasn't blocking anything. It had already been cut through, cleanly, cross-sectioned in 2 clean pieces pulled off to either side of the trail, leaving a clear path down the middle. Her first thought was relief: less work, one less hazard to deal with before the weekend. Her second thought, a few seconds later, was that nobody had been dispatched to that section besides her. She radioed dispatch to check if another crew had gotten there first. Dispatch had no record of it. No trail crew, no volunteer maintainer. Nobody logged into that section in the past week besides her. She figured maybe a local with a chainsaw had done some unofficial trail angel work, which happened sometimes. People who lived near the corridor and didn't love bureaucracy, but did love keeping the trail clear. She logged it as cleared, noted the discrepancy for the file, and moved on with her day, because that's what you do when the alternative explanation makes no sense, and the mundane one, however unlikely, at least fits inside the shape of things you already understand. 3 days later, a different hiker radioed in a second blowdown, this one about 2 miles further north, also described as a full tree across the trail, also urgent. Birdie hiked out to clear it and found the same thing waiting for her. Already cut, already cleared. The same clean cross-section, no chainsaw scarring on the wood, no sign of anyone having been there before her. This time, she got down on one knee and actually looked at the cut instead of just being grateful for it. A chainsaw leaves a specific kind of mark, parallel striations from the chain teeth, a slight burn where the blade heats the wood. This cut had none of that. It looked more like it had been worked with a hand axe, methodical, patient, the kind of cut that takes real time and real strength to make cleanly through a trunk that size. She'd worked with every maintainer in that district over 6 seasons. None of them used a hand axe on wood that big anymore. Nobody did. It wasn't efficient, and efficiency was the whole reason chainsaws existed. She radioed dispatch again, this time asking directly if any historical maintainer records showed hand tool clearing techniques for that section. Dispatch came back a few hours later with nothing useful. Old equipment logs, nothing specific enough to explain what she was looking at. She logged it as cleared and kept walking, but she started paying closer attention after that. The way you do when a pattern starts feeling less like coincidence and more like something with a rhythm to it. That evening, back at the small ranger station that served as her base for the season, she mentioned the 2 incidents to an old-timer who worked dispatch and was close to retirement. A man who'd been with the district longer than anyone else on staff. He listened to the whole thing without much reaction, poured himself coffee, and told her, quietly, that some sections of that trail kept their own maintenance, and that the smart thing to do was log what she found and not ask too many questions about who'd done the clearing. She asked him what he meant by that. He didn't really answer. He just said that in his 30 years with the district, this wasn't the first time it had happened, and every ranger who'd worked that stretch long enough eventually stopped asking, because the answers you found were worse than the ones you didn't. She laughed it off at the time, mostly because laughing felt better than the alternative, and went back to her cabin for the night. That was before the storm closed the access road for 2 days, and before the radio in the corner of her station, the one that had been decommissioned 2 full seasons earlier, sitting unused on a shelf because the district had switched frequencies, crackled once in the middle of the night with a check-in call using a trail crew code she didn't recognize, spoken by nobody currently on staff. She sat up in her cot in the dark, listening to that dead radio hum with residual static after the voice cut out, and reached for the light switch with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. The road wouldn't reopen for another 2 days. Until then, she was alone at that station with a piece of equipment that shouldn't have been able to talk to her at all. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat with the station's actual working radio in her lap, the modern one, the one on the district's current frequency, and kept it close like it could do something the old one couldn't. The decommissioned unit sat dark and silent on its shelf for hours afterward, exactly the way it was supposed to, unplugged from anything that should have let it transmit or receive. She checked the cord twice. It wasn't connected to a power source at all. That detail bothered her more than the voice had. By morning, she'd convinced herself it was some kind of atmospheric fluke, a stray signal bouncing off the mountains from another frequency entirely, picked up by a unit that had no business picking up anything. Old equipment does strange things sometimes, especially with a storm system moving through. She'd heard of stranger interference before. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it was an explanation. And after a night like that, satisfying wasn't really what she was looking for. The road stayed closed. 2 full days of rain hammering the station's tin roof, the kind of steady percussion that becomes its own kind of silence once your brain stops registering it as sound. She kept busy with paperwork, radio logs, cataloging the blowdown reports from earlier that week, trying to keep her hands occupied so her mind wouldn't wander back to the shelf in the corner. On the second night, it happened again. Same time, almost to the minute. She checked her watch afterward, and it was within 4 minutes of the first incident. The same crackle of static resolving into a voice, using the same trail crew code. 3 short syllables she didn't recognize from any current roster. This time, she made herself get up and stand in front of the unit while it happened, watching the dead dial, the unlit power light, the disconnected cord coiled uselessly beside it. The voice came through anyway, thin and distant, like it was being broadcast from somewhere much further away than a radio signal should travel. And then it cut out exactly the way it had before, leaving nothing behind but a low hiss that faded on its own. She pulled the district's old assignment archive the next morning. The physical binder kept in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in years, cross-referencing radio call signs against maintainer records going back decades. It took her most of the morning, working by the gray light coming through the station's single window while rain kept falling outside. She found the call sign eventually, buried in records from over 30 years earlier, assigned to a trail maintainer who'd worked that exact section, the same stretch with the 2 impossible blowdowns, before he died on the job, decades before Birdie had ever set foot on that trail. The code matched, not similar, matched exactly, a specific check-in phrase that, according to the archive notes, had belonged only to him, a personal shorthand he'd used with dispatch that nobody else on record had ever adopted. She sat with that for a long time before she did anything else. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes from realizing something impossible has a name attached to it, even if the name doesn't explain anything. It didn't make her feel less afraid. If anything, having a name made it worse, because now the voice wasn't just strange, it belonged to someone. The road reopened on the 3rd day. She drove out that afternoon to inspect the 2 blowdown sites one more time before filing her final report, partly out of duty and partly because she needed to see them again in daylight. Needed to convince herself the clean cuts had some explanation that fit inside a world she understood. At the second site, the one 2 miles north, she examined the cross-section more closely than she had the first time and found tool marks she'd missed before. A specific pattern of overlapping strikes, consistent in spacing, the kind of signature a skilled hand axe user leaves without meaning to. She photographed it and, back at the station, cross-referenced it against old equipment inventories from the archive. It matched tools that hadn't been standard district equipment in over 20 years. Tools that, according to the same records, had belonged to the maintainer whose call sign she'd already traced to that decommissioned radio. She filed her incident report honestly, describing exactly what she'd found, and the official response came back a week later, attributing the radio static to atmospheric interference from the storm system. A tidy explanation that closed the file without addressing the call sign, without addressing the tool marks, without addressing any of it directly. Nobody asked her to elaborate. Nobody seemed particularly interested in elaborating themselves. She requested a transfer the following spring to a different section of the district entirely, and it was granted without much discussion. She still works as a ranger today, just not on that stretch. What she's never been able to explain, even to herself, is that in the months before her transfer, whenever a blowdown came in on that section and she had to clear it before someone else could, she found herself instinctively reaching for a hand axe instead of the chainsaw, working the wood in that same patient, methodical rhythm, a technique she'd never been taught and had no memory of learning. She still doesn't know why. She stopped trying to explain it to people who ask. Another story, this one from a shuttle driver who's run hikers between road crossings for 15 years, follows the same pattern in a quieter way. The driver's name was Dale, and by the time this happened, he'd been running the shuttle route between trailheads in the small towns nearby for 15 years, long enough that hikers passed his number around online without him ever having to advertise. He knew every bend on that stretch of mountain road the way most people know their own kitchen. He wasn't superstitious. 15 years of driving hikers at all hours through fog and rain, and pitch-black switchbacks had worn most of that out of him early on. What replaced it wasn't fear. It was a kind of careful respect for the road itself, the way you respect ice you can't see under fresh snow. That particular evening, he'd gotten a call late in the afternoon from a hiker who'd missed his window and needed a pickup at a gap crossing well after dark had already settled in. It wasn't unusual. Late starts happened all the time. Someone underestimates their mileage. Someone's ankle gives out. Someone just loses track of daylight the way you do on a long trail. Dale grabbed his thermos of gas station coffee, the same brand he always got, and headed out on the 20-minute drive up to the gap. The hiker waiting there was younger, maybe mid-20s, quiet in the particular way exhausted people get quiet, more interested in getting warm in the back seat than making conversation. Dale didn't push it. He'd learned over the years that some hikers wanted to talk your ear off about their day and some just wanted silence, and either was fine with him. He kept the radio low, checked his mirrors on the tight hairpins the way he always did, and settled into the drive down. About halfway down the mountain, on a long straight stretch between two switchbacks, his headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. A man, barefoot, standing perfectly still, facing the road like he was waiting for something. Dale slowed slightly out of habit. You always slow down for a pedestrian on a road with no shoulder, especially at night. But the man didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything you'd expect from someone waiting for a ride or trying to flag down help. He just stood there in the wash of the headlights, watching the van pass, and then he was gone behind them into the dark the way anything does once your lights move past it. Dale didn't think much of it beyond a passing thought that it was a strange spot for someone to be standing at that hour. No vehicle around, no trailhead nearby that would explain foot traffic. Rural roads had all kinds of odd sights at night. He kept driving. 2 bends later, on a section of road that curved back toward the same stretch he'd just passed through. A hairpin that, on the map, put you maybe a quarter mile from where you'd just been, as the crow flies, though the road itself added another 1.5 miles of switchback to get there. His headlights caught the same figure again. Same barefoot man, same still posture, facing the road. Same wash of light passing over him and then leaving him behind in the dark. Dale's first thought was that it had to be a different person, someone walking the same general direction, maybe cutting across on foot between bends the way a local might if they knew the terrain well enough to shortcut through the trees. That was a reasonable thought. People who grew up in these hills could move through them faster than a road ever could. He almost let it go at that. Then, a third time, on a straight stretch further down the mountain where there was no possible shortcut between the 2 locations. No trail, no gap in the trees. Nothing but steep wooded slope that no person could have crossed on foot in the time it would have taken Dale's van to wind down the switchbacks. The headlights caught the same figure standing in almost the identical posture. Dale kept his eyes forward and his hand steady on the wheel, the way you do when you've decided, consciously, not to react to something in front of a passenger. He didn't say anything. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Fog, playing tricks with the shapes at the edge of the light. Exhaustion doing something to his own perception after a long day of driving. Some combination of things that would make sense if he thought about it later, in daylight, somewhere that wasn't this road. From the back seat, the hiker spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "Did you see that guy standing weird back there?" Dale glanced in the rearview mirror. The hiker was looking out the side window, back the way they'd come, his face pale in the dashboard light. "Yeah," Dale said. "I saw him." Neither of them said anything else about it. Dale kept driving, and the hiker kept watching the dark road behind them like he expected to see the figure again. And somewhere in that silence they both understood, without needing to say it out loud, that they'd each seen the same thing independently, from different angles, at different points, and that neither of them had an explanation that made it smaller. Dale dropped the hiker at the motel in town without either of them mentioning it again. That night, instead of taking his usual route home along that same stretch of road, he drove the long way around. adding almost 40 minutes to a drive that normally took 15. He didn't examine that decision too closely. It felt like the right one, and that was enough for him at the time. He didn't think much more about it until a week later, when he picked up a different hiker at the same gap crossing, and the man mentioned, unprompted, somewhere around the second bend, that he'd heard from someone on the trail about a barefoot figure that showed up on that stretch of road at night, standing at the same bend over and over, in a way that didn't make sense. Dale asked him carefully which bend. The hiker described it. It was the third one, the one where no trail or shortcut existed to explain how anyone could have beaten Dale's van there. That was the first time Dale started to understand that whatever he'd seen wasn't a one-time trick of fog and fatigue. It had a location. It had a pattern, and apparently it had been happening long before that night, to other drivers, other hikers, people who had never talked to each other and had never compared notes, describing the exact same bend on the exact same stretch of mountain road. A week after that conversation, Dale mentioned the whole thing to Earl, the mechanic who'd serviced his shuttle vans for going on 12 years. Mostly because Earl was the kind of man who didn't gossip and didn't spook easy, and Dale needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't make him feel foolish for saying it. Earl didn't laugh. He didn't ask Dale to repeat himself either, the way you would if the story sounded unfamiliar. He just set down the wrench he'd been holding, wiped his hands on a rag, and said plainly that Dale shouldn't ever flash his headlights at anyone standing near that stretch of road. "He answers if you do," Earl said, and didn't offer anything else, and went back to the van like the conversation was finished. Dale asked him what he meant by answers. Earl just shook his head and told him some things were better left as a rule you followed instead of a story you understood, and that was as far as the conversation went. Dale drove away from that garage more unsettled than he'd been the night he actually saw the figure, because Earl wasn't a man who dealt in nonsense, and Earl clearly knew more than he was willing to say. For a while after that, Dale avoided the road after dark when he could help it, rerouting pickups through town even when it added time, telling hikers it was construction or better lighting, without ever specifying what he meant. Eventually, though, the job required what the job required, and a heavy rain one evening left him with no choice but to run that same stretch to retrieve a hiker who'd gotten stranded at the gap crossing with no other way down. The rain came down hard enough that his wipers barely kept up, visibility dropping to maybe 30 feet in front of the van. About the same point on the road where he'd first seen the figure weeks earlier, the engine sputtered and died. He tried the ignition twice. Nothing. The van sat there on the shoulderless bend, rain hammering the roof, his headlights the only light for what felt like miles in either direction, and his phone showed no signal at all. He tried the ignition a third time. It caught, sputtered, died again. On the fourth try, the engine turned over and the headlights flared back to life, cutting through the rain onto the same stretch of road, and the barefoot figure was standing there again, closer to the van than it had been on any of the 3 passes weeks earlier, though the van itself hadn't moved an inch the entire time it sat stalled. Dale didn't wait to process what that meant. He put the van in gear the second the engine caught properly and drove, faster than the road really allowed in that rain, all the way down to the trailhead where the stranded hiker was waiting under the overhang of the ranger kiosk, soaked and grateful, and completely unaware of what had just happened 2 miles up the mountain. Later, back at the garage, Dale asked Earl to pull the dash cam footage from that stalled interval, mostly because he needed to know if what he'd seen was actually there, if some part of it had been captured on something other than his own frightened memory. Earl reviewed it in the office without saying much, and when Dale asked what was on it, Earl told him the footage from that exact window, engine dead to engine restarting, was nothing but static, clean video before and after, with nothing but visual noise in between. Dale asked to see it himself. Earl said the van just needed a tune-up and changed the subject, and didn't bring the dash cam up again, and didn't offer to show him the recording. And Dale, for reasons he still can't fully explain, didn't push it. He still runs that route today because the job requires it, but he doesn't run it after dark anymore if there's any way around it. When hikers ask why he takes the long way at certain hours, he tells them it's for the road conditions, or the deer activity, or whatever explanation seems easiest in the moment. He's never told a single one of them about the figure, or about Earl's warning, or about the static on the dash cam that swallowed up exactly the minutes he needed it not to. The fourth account belongs to a family whose land borders the corridor near an old homestead. Most hikers only pass on the Blue Blaze shortcut. The hostel sat about a quarter mile off a road crossing, a converted farmhouse with a separate bunk cabin out back that the owner rented to hikers needing a night off the trail. A shower, a real bed, a load of laundry that didn't smell like 3 days of sweat and rain. Most through hikers who stopped there stayed one night and moved on the next morning. The guy in this story, trail name Ledger, stayed 2 nights because his feet had blistered badly enough over the past week that a 0 day felt less like an indulgence and more like a medical necessity. He'd been on the trail about 5 weeks by then, comfortable in the rhythm of it. The kind of hiker who no longer thought twice about strange shelter noises or the general unpredictability of sleeping in the woods. A hostel was supposed to be the safe part, the part where nothing was expected to go wrong. That was, in fact, exactly why the owner gave him what she called the quiet room. A small single at the back of the cabin, away from the bunk room where a group of loud section hikers were staying that same night. She said it like a kindness, and it was meant as one. Ledger appreciated the idea of a door he could actually close. The first evening was as ordinary as hostel nights get. He soaked his feet in a plastic bucket the owner kept by the porch specifically for that purpose, did a load of laundry in the ancient washer that rattled through its spin cycle like it might walk itself across the floor, and ate a real meal, pasta from a box, but real pasta, cooked on a real stove, sitting on the porch steps while his socks dried on a line strung between 2 porch posts. He flipped through the cabin's guest book while he ate, the way most hikers do, half out of boredom and half because trail names scrawled in a beat-up notebook are their own kind of entertainment. Most entries were the usual stuff. Thanks for the shower. The pancakes were great. Watch out for the mouse in bunk 3. That night, lying in the quiet room with his blistered feet elevated on a rolled-up jacket, he heard 3 knocks come from the wall behind his bed. Knock, knock, knock. Evenly, spaced, deliberate. The kind of pattern you'd use if you were trying to get someone's attention on purpose, rather than the random tap of a pipe expanding or a branch against siding. He sat up, listened, and told himself it was old plumbing. Hostels like this one ran ancient systems, pipes rattling behind thin walls all the time, especially with a house full of hikers running showers and washing machines back to back. That was a perfectly good explanation. He lay back down. The knocking came again a few minutes later. Same pattern, same wall. He got up this time and knocked back once, mostly as a joke to himself, expecting silence or maybe an apologetic voice from whoever was in the adjoining room saying, "Sorry, didn't realize these walls were so thin." Nobody answered. He checked, and the room next door, he could see through the thin gap under the connecting door, was dark and empty. The section hikers were all bunked in the main cabin on the other side of the building, nowhere near this wall at all. He told himself it was pipes again. and that being alone in an unfamiliar room after dark was making him read intention into something purely mechanical. And eventually he fell asleep with the sound, still occasionally, ticking through the wall behind his head, 3 taps at a time, never quite in the same rhythm twice. The second night, the same thing happened, almost to the hour. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, coming from that same wall, at almost the exact time it had happened the night before. This time, he didn't get up. He lay there and counted the seconds between knocks instead, some part of him needing to prove to himself there was a pattern he could understand, a mechanical cause with a mechanical rhythm. The problem was that the rhythm wasn't mechanical. Pipes don't wait for you to stop moving before they knock again. This did. In the morning, still turning it over in his head, he went back through the guest book more carefully than he had the first night, flipping further back through the pages, past months of entries, past a full season of hikers, looking for anything that might explain the sound. He found it about 2/3 of the way through the book, an entry dated years earlier, in handwriting he didn't recognize, describing almost exactly what he'd experienced. 3 knocks on the back wall, evenly spaced, stopping the moment the hiker held still. The page it was written on looked different from the ones around it. Slightly discolored at the edges, the way paper looks when it's been handled more than the surrounding pages, and along the spine, he noticed a thin strip of tape holding it into the binding, like at some point it had come loose and someone had carefully put it back exactly where it belonged. He sat there with the guest book open in his lap for a long moment, feet still blistered, still needing another day before he could comfortably hike, trying to decide whether the smart thing to do was ask the owner about it directly, or just let it go the way you let go of most strange things on the trail, chalking it up to one more story that didn't quite make sense and never would. He decided to ask. He found the owner in the kitchen that afternoon, a woman in her 50s named Carol, who'd run the hostel for going on a decade, the kind of person who dealt with hiker problems all day long, gear malfunctions, blister infections, homesickness, and rarely seemed rattled by any of it. He asked her, as casually as he could manage, about the quiet room and whether anyone had ever complained about knocking in the wall. Carol's hands stopped moving over the dishes for just a second before she kept washing. She asked him to describe exactly what he'd heard, and when he did, 3 taps, evenly spaced, always from the same wall. She was quiet for a while before she answered. She told him the back room, the one directly on the other side of that wall, had been closed to guests for 2 full seasons, several years back. She didn't offer the reason at first. When he pressed, gently, she said a hiker had stayed in that back room one night and refused to come out of it the following morning. Wouldn't answer the door, wouldn't respond to her calling through it, until she finally used her spare key and found him sitting in the corner of the room, awake, unharmed, but unwilling to explain what had happened or why he wouldn't leave until well past noon that day. He checked out within the hour and never came back through, and she'd closed the room to guests not long after, telling herself it needed repairs, though the truth was simpler than that. "Don't knock back," she told Ledger, quiet and direct, the closest thing to a warning she gave him the whole conversation. "And don't sleep with your pack against that wall." He thanked her, more unsettled than reassured, and told himself one more night in the quiet room would be fine, especially since he planned to head back out to the trail the next morning regardless. That plan changed when a storm rolled through overnight, heavy enough that the trail crew radioed a warning about flash flooding on the lower sections, and every hiker at the hostel, including Ledger, ended up staying an extra day whether they wanted to or not. The hostel filled up fast with hikers stuck off trail, every bunk taken, which meant Ledger stayed in the quiet room for a 3rd night instead of moving on. That night, the knocking came again. Same time, same rhythm. Except this time, it came from inside his own room's wall. The wall he now knew was shared directly with the boarded-off back room Carol had told him about. Not the adjoining guest room. The back room. The one that had been closed for 2 seasons. The one nobody was supposed to be able to access at all. He lay there in the dark, remembering Carol's warning, and did not knock back. He didn't move. He kept his breathing steady and quiet, the way you do when you're trying to convince something, or yourself, that you're already asleep. And the knocking continued at that same uneven interval for what felt like much longer than it had the previous 2 nights, before finally stopping sometime after 2 in the morning, all at once, the same way it always did. In the morning, once the rain had let up enough for people to move around outside, he mentioned to Carol that the knocking had been worse the night before, coming from the back room's side rather than the empty guest room. She went pale in a way he hadn't seen from her yet, and walked with him around the outside of the cabin to the back room's boarded window without saying much of anything. There, on the inside of the glass, visible even through years of dust and grime built up on a window that hadn't been opened in 2 full seasons, was a handprint pressed against the pane from the inside, facing outward, fingers splayed like someone had put their palm flat against the glass and held it there. The door to that room had been nailed shut the entire time. Nobody could have gotten inside to leave a print like that, and even if they somehow had, the placement of it, flat against the glass, from the inside, facing out toward the yard where Ledger and Carol now stood, didn't make sense for anyone trying to escape or signal for help. It looked, if anything, like something had simply been standing there, palm against the glass, watching whoever happened to walk by outside. Carol didn't say much after that. Within the week, she'd repainted the shared wall of the quiet room, and when Ledger checked the hostel's listing online months later out of curiosity, the back room no longer appeared in any of the photos at all, as if it had quietly been edited out of the property's existence. He went looking for the guest book entry that had matched his own experience, the one with the taped-in page, wanting to show someone, anyone, proof that this wasn't just his imagination. And the page was gone the next time he thought to check. The binding smooth where the tape had been, no gap, no sign it had ever been there at all. The next account comes from a family with land near a gap most maps still show as unnamed. Her name was Renee, and she'd driven up from 3 states away to deal with her grandfather's property after he passed that spring. The kind of practical trip nobody wants to take, but everybody eventually has to, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings, deciding what to keep, what to sell, and what to do with a piece of land that had been in the family since before the trail even had an official corridor running past it. Her grandfather had lived alone up there for the last 20 years of his life. A quiet man who kept to himself, tended a small garden, and occasionally mentioned hikers cutting through on the Blue Blaze shortcut that ran along the edge of his property, usually with more amusement than complaint. Renee wasn't sentimental about the land itself. She'd grown up visiting a handful of times as a kid and hadn't been back in over a decade. Her plan was straightforward. Spend a week cleaning the place out, meet with the county clerk about the property lines and whether the boundary agreement with the trail corridor still held, and figure out whether selling made more sense than trying to maintain a property that far from anywhere she actually lived. The first few days were exactly as tedious as she expected. Boxes of old receipts, decades of magazines, furniture that smelled like mothballs and time. She drove into the nearest small town each evening for dinner at the one diner still open past 6, drank coffee that was more bitter than good, and made small talk with an elderly waitress who remembered her grandfather fondly and asked after the family the way people do in towns where everyone still knows everyone. It was on the fourth day, going through the desk in what had been her grandfather's study, that she found the notebook. It wasn't hidden exactly, just tucked into the back of a drawer beneath some old tax documents. A spiral-bound thing with a cracked spine, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. She almost didn't open it, assuming it was more of the same. Old records, notes about the garden, nothing worth reading closely. But the handwriting on the first page she flipped to wasn't her grandfather's, and neither was the second or the third. The entries were dated across what looked like decades, each one describing a hiker by trail name rather than legal name, the way section hikers and through hikers refer to each other on the trail. Nicknames, not real identities. Some entries were short, just a name and a date. Others ran longer, describing specific incidents. A knock on a shelter beam, a voice using someone's name from the tree line, a barefoot figure standing at a bend in a road. The handwriting shifted from entry to entry, sometimes cramped and slanted, sometimes rounder and more careful, as if a dozen different people had taken turns writing in the same book over the years. She sat with it for a long time before doing anything else, telling herself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe her grandfather had collected these stories the way some old-timers collect local legends, transcribing things he'd heard secondhand from hikers passing through, or from conversations at the general store that used to sit at the crossroads before it closed. That was a reasonable thought. People in these mountains had always traded stories about the trail, the same way people everywhere trade stories about the strange things that happen near where they live. What she couldn't quite explain away was one entry, roughly 2/3 through the notebook, describing a knocking pattern, 3 taps, evenly spaced, and a barefoot figure standing at a road bend at night, in detail specific enough that it matched, almost word for word, things she'd since read in passing on hiking forums online, posted by strangers describing their own experiences on that same stretch of trail. Her grandfather had never used a computer in his life. He couldn't have read those forum posts. And yet, here was an entry, dated years before any of those posts existed, describing the same thing in language close enough to feel less like coincidence and more like something being recorded from a shared source neither party had access to. She kept reading, mostly out of a compulsion she couldn't quite name, flipping toward the back of the notebook where the entries grew sparser, spaced further apart, as if whatever had been filling this book had slowed down over the years the way a habit does before it stops entirely. The final entry was dated exactly 1 week before her grandfather died. It wasn't about a hiker. It didn't use a trail name. It described, in plain, unhurried handwriting, that finally did match her grandfather's own careful hand from his letters. A woman driving up to the property alone, going through boxes in his study, finding a notebook in the desk drawer. It described Renee, sitting exactly where she was sitting now, reading exactly what she was reading, on a day that, according to the entry, hadn't happened yet when he wrote it. She closed the notebook and didn't open it again that night. She told herself the date was a coincidence, that her grandfather might have written something vague enough to apply to anyone who eventually came through his things. That memory and grief were doing something to her reading of it that wasn't really there on the page. She almost believed that. She'd believed stranger things to get through worse weeks. The next evening at the diner, she made the mistake, or maybe not a mistake, she still isn't sure, of mentioning the notebook to the elderly waitress who'd known her grandfather for years. She didn't go into detail, just described it as an old notebook she'd found in his desk, full of stories about hikers. The waitress's expression changed the second the words left Renee's mouth, a kind of stillness settling over her face that hadn't been there a moment earlier. The waitress asked, carefully, whether the notebook had a cracked spine, spiral-bound drugstore paper. Renee said yes. The waitress didn't ask anything else. She refilled Renee's coffee without being asked, glanced toward the door as if checking who else was in the diner, and lowered her voice before saying the only thing she was willing to say on the subject. "Don't read it out loud on the land," she said. "He always said it listens for its name." Renee asked what that meant, what it referred to, whether her grandfather had ever explained further. The waitress shook her head and said that was all she knew, all she was willing to say, and that some things were better left as instructions than as explanations. She went back to work behind the counter and didn't return to the subject again for the rest of the meal, no matter how Renee tried to bring it back up gently. Renee drove back to the property that night more unsettled than she wanted to admit, telling herself the smart thing to do was finish the inventory quickly, get the notebook out of the house along with everything else, and put the whole strange week behind her as soon as possible. A storm rolled in not long after she arrived, heavier than the forecast had suggested, the kind of late-season system that dumps enough rain to turn a gravel drive to soup within an hour. By the time she thought to check, the storm had already knocked out her cell signal entirely, and the old gate at the end of the drive, the one her grandfather had always kept chained and locked, had somehow swung shut and latched on its own in the wind, blocking her car in until she could get out and deal with it by hand. She wasn't in the mood to fight a rusted chain in the rain at 11 at night. She decided to wait until morning. That was around midnight when she first heard the knocking coming from the old barn, a good 100 yards from the house. 3 taps at a time, evenly spaced, carrying clearly across the wet, still air despite the distance and the rain. She sat in her grandfather's study with every light in the house turned on, telling herself it was a loose board banging in the wind, telling herself the storm was doing exactly what storms do to old outbuildings. The knocking continued at intervals through most of the night, never getting louder, never getting closer to the house itself, just steady and patient out there in the dark. She didn't sleep. In the morning, once daylight had returned some sense of normalcy to the property, she went back to the desk to put the notebook away properly, wanting to be done with the whole thing, and found a new entry on the final blank page. It was in her own handwriting. She had no memory of writing it. It described the knocking from the barn, described the storm, described the gate swinging shut on its own, all of it recorded in careful, precise language, in her hand, dated for that exact night. She checked the gate at the end of the drive an hour later, once the rain had cleared enough to walk down and deal with the chain herself. It was already open, standing wide, chain hanging loose, though she was certain as she could be after a sleepless night, that she'd checked it twice the evening before and found it firmly latched. She sold the land within the year, faster than she probably should have for the price she got, telling the realtor only that she didn't want to deal with the upkeep from out of state. The buyer was a developer working on properties adjacent to the corridor, and months later, through a mutual contact back in town, she heard that he'd found something similar in one of the outbuildings during a renovation. A spiral notebook, cracked spine, drugstore paper, and that when asked about it, he'd refused to discuss it any further with anyone who brought it up. Renee kept one page from the notebook before she handed the property over, tearing it out carefully the night before closing. She has never shown it to anyone. She won't say which entry it is. The account after this one is the strangest in the collection, and it comes from a hiker who never made it past a place with no name on any map. Her trail name was Compass, and by the time this happened, she was 5 weeks into a through hike she'd been planning for 2 years. The kind of hiker who knew her data book cold, who'd logged more solo overnight miles than most people log in a lifetime of car camping, and who had exactly zero interest in ghost stories or trail folklore beyond the mild entertainment of hearing other hikers tell them around a fire. She was practical. She was experienced. She was not the kind of person who scared easily, and that mattered. because what happened to her on that bald wasn't something fear could explain away on its own. It was mid-morning on an otherwise unremarkable day, cool and clear, good hiking weather. The kind of day where you make better mileage than usual because your legs finally feel strong instead of just tired. She'd checked her data book at the last shelter for the next water source, adjusted her trekking poles for the coming climb, and eaten a bar on the move rather than stopping, trying to bank some extra miles before the terrain got steeper further north. The trail climbed out of the trees onto an exposed bald, one of those open grassy summits the trail crosses periodically, offering views for miles in every direction, and usually a fair amount of wind, since balds sit high enough to catch whatever weather system happens to be moving through. She'd crossed dozens of similar balds over the past 5 weeks. This one looked no different on approach. Grass moving in the breeze, clouds drifting steadily overhead, the kind of open, ordinary mountaintop that made her glad to be out of the tree cover for a while. The moment she stepped onto it, the wind stopped. Not died down, not shifted direction. Stopped completely all at once, the way a sound cuts out when you turn off a speaker. She noticed it immediately because the grass around her feet, which had been moving steadily in the wind just steps behind her at the tree line, went completely still the instant she crossed onto the open bald, as if some boundary existed there that the wind simply didn't cross. She stood for a moment, testing it, the way you test something you don't quite believe. She looked back toward the tree line she'd just left, where the wind was clearly still moving through the branches, visible in the swaying of leaves and the bending of thinner limbs. Then she looked forward across the bald, where the tall grass sat motionless despite being fully exposed, with nothing blocking it from the same air that was clearly still moving just yards behind her. She told herself it was a wind shadow effect, something to do with the shape of the ridgeline funneling air around this particular bald rather than across it. She'd read about strange microclimates on exposed summits before, pockets where terrain created unusual dead zones and otherwise consistent wind patterns. It was a reasonable explanation. It fit inside the kind of thing that happens in mountains sometimes. What didn't fit, and what she noticed only after she'd already started crossing the open ground, was the silence that came with it. Not just the absence of wind, but the absence of everything else that should have accompanied a clear, cool mid-morning on an exposed summit. No birds, no insects, no rustle of grass beneath her own boots, even though she could feel the blades brushing against her legs as she walked. The visual world kept moving. Clouds drifted steadily overhead, their shadows crossing the bald in slow, unbroken patterns. But the sound of the place had gone completely flat, like someone had turned the volume down on everything except her own footsteps and her own breathing. She picked up her pace without consciously deciding to, some part of her responding to the wrongness of the place before her rational mind had fully caught up to what was wrong about it. She didn't run. She told herself running would be an overreaction to a strange but harmless quirk of terrain. And she kept that composure the whole way across. Boots finding purchase on exposed rock in a few spots where the trail crossed bare stone rather than grass. She didn't look back until she felt tree cover close in around her again on the far side of the bald, and the moment she crossed back under the canopy, the wind returned all at once, sudden and full, branches swaying, leaves rustling, the whole sensory texture of the forest snapping back into place like a held breath finally released. She stood there for a minute, catching her own breath, telling herself it had been nothing. Some strange pocket of dead air explained by physics she didn't fully understand and didn't need to. She kept hiking. She didn't mention it to anyone that day, mostly because there wasn't anyone to mention it to, and partly because she wasn't entirely sure how to describe it in a way that wouldn't sound ridiculous. It wasn't until she reached the next shelter that evening, tired and hungry, and ready to put the whole strange morning behind her, that an older section hiker sharing the shelter that night mentioned the same bald by a name that didn't appear anywhere on her map, and asked her carefully whether she'd kept walking through it. The section hiker was older, maybe 60, gray-bearded, with the kind of gear that suggested decades of experience rather than a recent gear store shopping spree. He introduced himself with a trail name Compass didn't recognize from any of the register entries she'd seen over the past 5 weeks, which struck her as odd for someone who clearly knew the trail this well. He mentioned the bald casually, almost in passing, as they compared notes on the day's mileage, calling it by a name, something old, something local, nothing that matched the official designation printed in her data book. "You went through a Featherstone today, didn't you?" he said, not quite a question. "Kept walking, I hope." She asked him what he meant, and he studied her for a moment before answering, the way people do when they're deciding how much of something to say out loud. He told her, in a low voice, that she shouldn't ever stop on that bald, shouldn't sit down, shouldn't set up camp there even if the view made it tempting, even if the flat open ground made it look like good tent space compared to the rocky, root-tangled sites further down the trail. "It's not about you," he said. "It's about anyone who stays still long enough." She pressed him for more, the way you do when someone gives you half a warning and leaves the rest hanging. But he wouldn't elaborate beyond that. Just repeated the same core instruction in slightly different words. Don't stop there, don't sit down, keep moving until you're through it. And then change the subject to easier things: water sources, weather forecasts, ordinary trail talk. She let it go, mostly because pushing further felt like it would embarrass them both. But she filed the warning away carefully, the specific, practical kind of warning that felt earned rather than superstitious. That night, weather forced a decision she hadn't planned on. A system was rolling in fast enough that pushing further to the next town, as she'd originally intended, would have meant hiking well past dark on unfamiliar terrain and worsening rain. Camping one ridge over from the bald was the more sensible option, even though it put her closer to that stretch of trail than she would have liked, given the conversation from earlier that evening. She set up her tent in a stand of trees just off the ridge, ate a quick dinner, and settled in early, telling herself the warning had been about the bald specifically, not about camping anywhere near it. That was a reasonable distinction. It felt like enough of a boundary to sleep behind. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a voice calling her name. Not her trail name. Her real name, the one she used with family, with old friends, the one she hadn't given to a single person on the trail since starting her hike 5 weeks earlier. It came from somewhere in the direction of the bald, faint but unmistakable, carried on air that, according to every physical law she understood, shouldn't have been carrying sound this clearly across a ridge and through a stand of trees at this hour. She lay perfectly still in her sleeping bag, listening, telling herself it was some trick of acoustics, some hiker calling out for a lost dog, or a missing companion whose name happened to sound similar to hers. That explanation held together for about as long as it took the voice to call her name a second time, in the exact same tone, the exact same inflection her own mother used, and she realized with a cold, sinking certainty that this wasn't a coincidence of sound. It was her actual name, spoken correctly, by something that had no reasonable way of knowing it. She reached for her phone with shaking hands, not to call anyone. There was no signal this far from a road, but to check her own notes app. Some instinct telling her to verify something before her mind convinced her otherwise. She scrolled back through her recent entries and found it almost immediately. 2 shelters back, exhausted after a long day, she'd signed the register using her real name instead of her trail name. A small mental slip she hadn't even noticed making at the time. done purely for record-keeping purposes, a habit left over from filling out permit forms earlier in her hike. She sat with that discovery for a long time in the dark, the voice outside continuing to call her name at slow, patient intervals, never getting louder, never seeming to move closer, just repeating itself from the direction of the bald with an inflection that got very slightly, very subtly wrong each time, like something learning the shape of a word without fully understanding what it meant. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She lay watching the thin wall of her tent, waiting for movement that never quite resolved into a shape, listening to a voice that eventually stopped sometime before dawn, all at once, the way it always seemed to stop in every account like this one. By first light, the bald was silent again from a distance, exactly the way it had been the morning before. Still, waiting, apparently returned to whatever ordinary state it held between whatever it was that happened there. She broke camp early, packed quickly, and made the decision to cross the bald again that morning rather than take a longer reroute around it, mostly because the reroute would have cost her the better part of a day, and mostly because she told herself in the daylight that nothing that happened at night could follow her into full sun. She was wrong about that, though not in the way she expected. She approached the bald from the same direction she had the day before, watching for the boundary where the wind would die, and found it exactly where she remembered, the tree line giving way to open grass, the moving branches behind her falling suddenly still ahead. She stepped through it anyway, faster this time, boots finding the same worn trail line, telling herself the sooner she crossed, the sooner it would be behind her for good. About halfway across, she saw the pack. It sat in the center of the bald, upright, leaning against nothing, the way a hiker sets a pack down when they're planning to come right back for it. Not dropped, not fallen, but placed deliberately, exactly where the open ground flattened out into the best possible tent site on the entire summit. There was no owner in sight, no tent set up nearby, no sign of a person anywhere across the whole exposed stretch of grass, which offered clear sight lines in every direction for 100 yards or more. She stood still, listening, the way you do when every instinct is telling you to be careful about how you move. The silence out there was the same as it had been the day before. No wind, no birds, no insects, nothing but her own breathing, and the distant, unaffected sound of clouds' shadows sliding soundlessly across the grass. She thought about the section hiker's warning. Don't stop there, don't sit down. She had no intention of doing either, but leaving an abandoned pack unreported on a trail where hikers went missing wasn't something her training or her conscience would let her do either. She approached slowly, close enough to read the trail name tag zip-tied to the top strap, a common practice among hikers, a small durable label with a name and sometimes an emergency contact, without getting close enough to touch anything else. The name on the tag matched, almost exactly, a name she recognized from a missing hiker alert she'd seen posted at a trailhead kiosk 2 towns back, a case from 2 seasons earlier that had never been closed. A hiker who'd vanished somewhere along this general stretch of trail without a body, without a resolution, without an explanation that satisfied anyone who'd looked into it. She didn't touch the pack. She memorized what she could, the tag, the general condition, the placement, and backed away from it the same way she'd approach an animal she didn't want to startle, walking backward across the open grass with her eyes on the pack until the tree line closed in behind her, and the wind returned, all at once, exactly the way it had the day before. She reported it at the next town, at the ranger station attached to the small visitors center, describing the location as precisely as she could. Search and rescue found the pack exactly where she'd said, in the exact condition she'd described. What they didn't find was any sign of the missing hiker. No remains, no additional gear, nothing to indicate what had happened to him beyond the pack itself. And the pack, according to the official report she later read secondhand through a hiker forum, showed almost no weathering consistent with having sat exposed on an open bald for 2 full seasons. The straps were still buckled properly. The fabric hadn't faded the way 2 years of sun and rain would have faded it. It looked, by every account she heard, like it had been placed there recently, not left there years earlier. The official incident report called it a recent cache, reopening the missing hiker's case without resolving it, without explaining how a pack belonging to someone who'd vanished 2 seasons earlier could show up looking freshly placed on a bald that, according to at least one local warning, wasn't a place anyone should stay long enough to leave anything behind at all. She heard later, through the same hiker grapevine, that rangers had started referring to that bald privately by the missing hiker's trail name, an informal designation that never made it onto any official map. Compass finished her through hike. She reached the northern terminus a little over a month later, exhausted and proud, and forever changed by something she still couldn't fully explain. But she never again wrote her real name anywhere on the trail after that night. Not in a register, not in a notes app, not even in a text to her family checking in from town. She skipped shelter logs entirely for the rest of her hike, printing brief notes on scrap paper the way other hikers in this same collection eventually learned to do, independently, without ever comparing stories with each other. She still thinks about how fresh that pack looked, sitting there in the open, waiting for someone to notice it. She still thinks about how the wind came back the instant she was 10 steps clear of the bald, as if it had been holding its breath the entire time she was inside that silence, and let it go only once she was safely gone. Another account, quieter but just as strange, comes from a hunting guide who's worked the ridges bordering the corridor for 20 years. His name was Wade, and by the time this happened, he'd been guiding hunts on the ridges bordering that stretch of corridor for going on 20 years. Long enough to know which draws held deer in the early season, which springs ran clean, and which weather fronts meant packing it in early before a storm caught you exposed on a ridgeline. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. 20 years of solo tracking through fog, of sitting still in a blind for hours, waiting on a buck that never showed, of hiking out injured clients on his own back when their ankles gave out miles from a road. That kind of work wears the easy fear out of you early. What replaced it, the way it had for most of the people in this collection, wasn't fearlessness. It was a working knowledge of what belonged in these woods and what didn't. That season, he had a client with him. A man from out of state who'd hunted plenty of other places but had never done a guided hunt in this particular terrain. The kind of steep, hollow-cut ridgeline where sound behaves strangely, and distance is hard to judge without years of practice reading it. Wade had trained him, like he trained every client, on basic safety signals. 3 sharp blasts on a whistle meant distress. Get to me now, something's wrong. It was standard practice, the kind of protocol you drilled into people before splitting up to glass different sections of a ridge. Mid-morning, with the client positioned downhill near a spring, and Wade working a game trail higher up the slope, he heard the whistle. 3 sharp blasts, unmistakable, exactly the signal he'd trained the client to use. The problem was the direction. It came from uphill, further up the ridge than Wade himself was standing, while his client was positioned well below him near the spring. There was no way for the sound to originate from uphill of Wade's own position if his client was the one blowing it from below. He didn't stop to work out the physics of it. 20 years of instinct sent him moving immediately, scrambling up the slope toward the sound, his mind running through worst-case scenarios. A second hunter in trouble, someone else's client lost on the same ridge, anything that would explain a distress signal coming from a direction that didn't match where his own client should have been. He found nothing at the source. No hunter, no sign of anyone having been there recently, just steep wooded slope, and the kind of silence that follows a sudden effort like that. His own breathing loud in his ears. He made his way back down to the spring, radioing a check-in to his second guide as he went, and found his client exactly where he'd left him, confused by Wade's sudden reappearance and completely unaware of any whistle at all. The client hadn't blown his whistle. He hadn't needed to. He was fine, glassing the far ridge for movement, wondering why Wade had come crashing back down the slope looking rattled. Wade told himself it was an echo, sound bouncing strangely off a rock face somewhere and reflecting back at an angle that made the origin point seem wrong. Mountain terrain does that sometimes, especially in narrow hollows where sound waves bounce between opposing slopes before reaching your ears. It was a reasonable explanation, and he'd heard of similar acoustic tricks happening to other hunters over the years. He filed it away and kept working the hunt. An hour later, the whistle came again. 3 sharp blasts, same unmistakable pattern, this time from a slightly different point along the same ridge, further along than the first time, as if whatever had made it was moving parallel to Wade's own position while staying roughly the same distance uphill. He checked his radio. His second guide, working a different section entirely, hadn't heard anything and wasn't anywhere near enough to explain it. His client, when Wade radioed down to check, confirmed again that he hadn't touched his whistle, sounding a little annoyed now at being asked twice about something he clearly hadn't done. By the third repetition, same pattern, another slight shift in position along the ridge, always uphill, always parallel. Wade had stopped trying to explain it away with acoustics. He kept his composure for the client's sake, finished out the hunt without saying anything alarming, and got both of them back to the trucks by early afternoon without incident, the client having no idea anything unusual had happened at all. That evening, back at the lodge where guides and clients stayed during multi-day hunts, Wade mentioned the whole thing to his second guide, a younger man named Pete who'd worked that same ridge for close to 8 years himself. He expected Pete to have some rational explanation, some acoustic quirk of the terrain that Wade, despite 2 decades of experience, had simply never encountered before. Instead, Pete just nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for Wade to bring this up eventually, and said hunters on that ridge had been reporting the same thing for years. A second whistle, always from slightly uphill of wherever you happened to be standing, always in that same unmistakable 3-blast pattern. "Don't answer a whistle you didn't call for," Pete said, "and don't hunt that ridge alone after the leaves drop. Plain and simple." Wade asked him what happened if you did answer it, or if you did hunt alone late in the season. Pete didn't have a clear answer for that, only that he'd made it a personal rule years earlier and had never had a reason to test what happened if he broke it, and he didn't intend to start now. Wade laughed it off at the time, mostly out of habit, the way you laugh off things that unsettle you more than you want to admit. He didn't laugh about it for long. That evening, after the conversation with Pete, a bank of fog rolled into the hollow faster than either of them expected, thick enough by last light to reduce visibility to a few yards in any direction. It wasn't unusual for that time of year. Cold air settling into low ground after a warm afternoon could do that in these mountains, especially near creek bottoms where moisture pooled. But it made the walk back to the trucks from the lodge's equipment shed more disorienting than either guide anticipated. Familiar terrain reduced to vague shapes and muffled sound. They were maybe halfway across the yard between the shed and the parking area when Wade heard the whistle again, close this time. Closer than any of the 3 times it had sounded on the ridge that morning. 3 sharp blasts, unmistakable, cutting through the fog from somewhere near enough that it should have meant a person standing just a few yards away, though neither Wade nor Pete could see anyone through the thick gray air surrounding them. Wade stopped walking. Pete stopped beside him. Neither said anything for a moment, both listening, both waiting to see if it would repeat. It did, but not in the same simple three-blast pattern from earlier. This time, there was a pause built into it. A specific rhythm, 3 blasts, a beat of silence, one more short blast, that matched, almost exactly, the pattern of Wade's own breathing from moments earlier, when he'd been catching his breath after the fast walk across the yard. It wasn't just mimicking a signal anymore. It was mimicking him specifically, matching a rhythm that belonged to his body in that exact moment, as if whatever was making the sound had been listening closely enough to copy something that personal. Neither man said much on the rest of the walk to the trucks. They didn't run, but they didn't linger either, and once they were both inside their vehicles with the doors locked, Pete rolled his window down just enough to say, "Get inside and don't come back out till morning," before pulling away toward his own cabin. Wade didn't sleep well that night, and in the morning, checking the muddy ground near the equipment shed out of some compulsion he couldn't quite explain, he found a set of fresh prints paralleling the exact route he and Pete had walked the evening before. Barefoot prints, human-shaped but subtly too long in the toe, evenly spaced in a stride pattern too consistent to belong to someone stumbling through fog. The prints ran alongside their walking path without ever crossing it, close enough to have been within arm's reach the whole way, and then stopped abruptly at a rock outcrop at the edge of the property, with no continuation on the other side, as if whatever made them had simply stopped existing at that point, or gone somewhere the ground itself couldn't record. He didn't mention the prints to his client, who checked out that morning satisfied with a hunt that had gone, from his perspective, entirely according to plan. Wade saw him off, shook his hand, and told him to come back next season. All the usual courtesies, all while the image of that whistle's rhythm, his own breathing, copied back to him from somewhere in the fog, sat lodged in the back of his mind in a way he couldn't quite dislodge. The guide service quietly stopped booking hunts on that particular ridge after Labor Day the following year, citing access issues in the official scheduling notes, though the land itself remained legally open and nothing had actually changed about who could hunt there. Wade never pushed to have that policy reversed, and neither did Pete. Clients who asked about it were simply told the ridge wasn't available that time of year, a vague enough explanation that nobody thought to question it further. Wade still guides today, still works that general stretch of corridor, but he carries 2 whistles now instead of 1, a habit he picked up without ever fully explaining it to himself, and he's developed a reflex he didn't have before that season. Every time he blows a whistle for any reason, distress or otherwise, he immediately turns to check who else might be within earshot, scanning the tree line the way you'd check a rearview mirror out of pure habit, whether or not there's any reason to expect someone behind you. He's never told a client the real reason the schedule changed. When Pete brings it up, which is rare, they don't discuss it much beyond a kind of tired, knowing look between 2 men who've both decided some things are better left as rules than as stories. The next 2 accounts come from the same fire tower, a season apart, and together they explain why the position has been harder to staff every year since. Her name was Sarah, and she'd taken the fire tower lookout position for a single season, the kind of seasonal work that suited her, solitary, methodical, paid decently for someone willing to spend months at a time in isolated elevation watching for smoke. She wasn't naive about the isolation. She'd done wildland work before, understood what it meant to go days without seeing another person, understood the particular discipline required to stay alert during long stretches where nothing happened at all. The job was mostly patience, scanning the horizon on a set schedule, radioing hourly check-ins to the district, logging weather conditions in a battered tower binder that had clearly seen decades of use before she'd ever touched it. The tower sat at elevation overlooking a long stretch of the corridor, close enough to a popular section of trail that she often tracked hiker traffic through her binoculars as a kind of secondary duty, noting anything unusual to relay down to rangers on the ground. Most days, that meant watching distant figures move steadily along visible stretches of switchback, packs bobbing, poles flashing in the sun, entirely unremarkable. It was mid-morning on an otherwise clear day when she first noticed the silhouette. A hiker, or what looked like one, standing motionless at a switchback roughly 2 miles distant, visible only because the trail crossed an exposed rocky section there with good sight lines from the tower. She logged the position out of habit, expecting the figure to resume moving within a few minutes the way hikers do when they stop briefly to catch their breath or check a map. An hour passed. The figure hadn't moved. She checked again periodically through her scheduled scans, and each time, the silhouette remained in the exact same position, same posture, same spot on the switchback, unmoving even as the light shifted around it through the middle of the day. She told herself it might be a rock formation she was misreading, some trick of the heat shimmer coming off the exposed stone making a static shape look vaguely human. That was a reasonable explanation. She'd misjudged distant shapes before, especially in the wavering heat of midday sun on bare rock. By early afternoon, the shape was still there, unchanged, and she found herself returning to her binoculars more often than her schedule required, some part of her needing to keep checking on something that unsettled her more. With each hour, it refused to move. 6 hours in, with the light beginning to angle lower and the shadows on the ridge stretching longer, the silhouette was still standing in the exact same position it had occupied since mid-morning, a length of stillness that made no sense for a living hiker who would need to eat, drink, adjust their pack, or simply shift their weight at some point across 6 hours of standing. Near dusk, she finally got a clearer look through her binoculars as the angle of the light improved, only to find the switchback empty. The figure was gone. Relief lasted about as long as it took her to scan the rest of the visible trail, because a second silhouette had appeared, in the same posture, standing motionless, at a different switchback further along the same section of trail. A location that, given the terrain and the time that had passed, would have required whoever it was to move faster between the 2 points than any hiker could reasonably manage on foot. She logged both sightings in the tower binder exactly as she'd observed them, without embellishment, factual and precise the way her training required, and radioed the second sighting into dispatch as a possible distressed hiker, since the description matched enough of the protocol for that kind of call to justify raising it. She kept her tone level on the radio. She didn't mention how long the first figure had stood still, or how quickly the second one would have needed to travel to reach its position. Some details felt too strange to say out loud over an open channel, even to a district that dealt in practical concerns and wouldn't know what to do with strangeness anyway. By the time full dark settled over the ridge, neither silhouette was visible anymore, and her scheduled radio check-ins continued through the evening without anything else unusual to report. She made coffee on the tower's small stove, more out of habit than actual desire for it, and let it go cold on the counter while she kept returning to the window, scanning the dark tree line below with a flashlight, even though she knew it wouldn't reach far enough to show her anything useful. She wrote up a full report before her shift ended that night, describing both sightings factually, noting the 6 hours of stillness, noting the impossible distance covered between the 2 locations. She didn't know, writing it, that this same report would eventually be cross-referenced against a call for search and rescue the next morning, when dispatch decided the possible distressed hiker description warranted an actual ground team. And she had no way of knowing yet what that ground team would find, or fail to find, at either switchback the following day. Search and rescue went out at first light the next morning. 2 rangers hiking to both switchback locations Sarah had logged from the tower. They found no hiker at either site, distressed or otherwise, no gear, no sign that anyone had passed through recently enough to explain what she'd seen. What they did find at both locations were sets of prints. 2 sets, side by side, pressed deep enough into the soft ground at the trail's edge to suggest someone had stood in place for an extended period. The impression depth consistent with hours rather than minutes. There were no approach tracks leading to either spot, no departure tracks leading away, just the standing impressions themselves, as if whoever made them had simply appeared there and simply stopped being there, without ever walking to or from the location the way a person moving through the woods normally would. The rangers radioed their findings up to the tower, and Sarah logged the report exactly as it came in, trying to keep her own reaction out of the official record, even as something cold settled in her chest at the description. That evening, unsettled enough that she reached out to a former lookout, who'd worked the same tower years earlier and had since retired to a cabin closer to town, she described what she'd seen and what the ground team had found, hoping for some explanation that would make the whole thing smaller. The retired lookout listened to the whole account without much surprise in his voice, which unsettled her more than if he'd sounded shocked. He told her the tower's binder, the same one she'd been logging into all season, had old entries describing that kind of stillness, going back years before her own tenure, and that the smart thing to do from here on was to stop logging future sightings as distressed hikers. "Just log what you see," he told her. "Don't call it in as a person needing help. It isn't." She asked him what it was, if not a person. He didn't have an answer for that or didn't want to give one, and the call ended without much more clarity than it started with. 2 nights later, a radio malfunction left her without contact through a full shift change, the relief lookout unable to reach her by any working frequency, forcing her to spend an entire overnight shift alone in the tower for the first time that season without the usual comfort of scheduled check-ins to break up the isolation. She kept busy with routine tasks, telling herself the malfunction was mechanical, that the district would sort it out by morning, that being alone overnight in a tower she'd occupied all season shouldn't feel any different than it normally did. It felt different almost immediately. Sometime after midnight, without her binoculars, without any equipment at all beyond her own eyes adjusting slowly to the dark, she saw a third stillness, not at a distant switchback this time, but directly below the tower, standing at the exact boundary where the tree line met the cleared ground around the tower's base, visible even in the poor light because of how completely it failed to move against a backdrop of branches that were, themselves, shifting slightly in the night breeze. She didn't reach for her radio because her radio wasn't working anyway. She sat very still at the tower's small desk, watching the shape at the tree line through the window, telling herself it would move eventually, the way anything alive eventually has to move. And it never did, not once, for as long as she kept watching. At some point before dawn, needing to do something other than stare at a shape that refused to confirm or deny what it was, she pulled out the old tower binder the retired lookout had mentioned, flipping back through years of entries looking for whatever old entries he'd referenced. She found them eventually, several seasons back, brief, factual logs describing stillness at switchbacks in language nearly identical to her own reports. And then, further back than that, in an entry dated a full season before she'd ever started this job, she found her own handwriting. The entry described, in careful factual detail, the exact sighting from that night, the radio malfunction, the shape at the tree line, even the specific weather conditions she'd noted in her own log just hours earlier, recorded as having happened before she'd ever set foot in this tower, in her own hand, dated for a night that, by every calendar she understood, hadn't existed yet when it was written. She sat with the binder open in her lap until the light started coming up gray through the tower's windows, and by the time her radio crackled back to life at dawn, with no explanation given for the outage beyond a brief, unhelpful note about line interference, the shape at the tree line was gone, the ground below showing nothing but ordinary undergrowth in the returning daylight. She finished out the season, but requested, quietly, not to be assigned to that tower again the following year, and the district reassigned her to a different district's rotation without asking many questions about why. The lookout who took over that tower the following season was younger, new to the job, a woman named Priya, who'd taken the position mostly for the isolation and the pay, without knowing much about what had happened there the year before. Sarah hadn't told her directly. Some things felt too strange to hand off as a formal warning, but she had mentioned briefly, almost offhand, that the old binder in the tower was worth reading through if she ever got bored during a slow shift. Priya found it during her first week, going through the tower's supplies and equipment the way any new lookout does, familiarizing herself with the space that would be her entire world for the next several months. The binder sat where it always had, on a shelf near the radio, its pages brittle with age, decades of handwriting layered one season on top of another. She flipped through it out of curiosity more than anything else, expecting weather logs and routine hiker counts. She found Sarah's entry from the previous season eventually, the one describing the radio malfunction and the shape at the tree line, and read it with the kind of detached interest new employees give to stories from before their time. What she didn't expect, reading further, was to find a second entry directly beneath it, describing the exact same night in nearly identical language, but dated for a shift that, according to the district's official schedule, hadn't happened yet. A date, roughly 2 weeks into Priya's own upcoming rotation, describing a radio malfunction, a tree line shape, and a decision to stay silent and simply wait it out until dawn. She didn't know what to make of that at first. She assumed it was some kind of clerical error, a date transposed wrong by a previous lookout working late and tired, the kind of small mistake that happens in handwritten logs kept across years by people who weren't always at their sharpest during overnight shifts. She noted it mentally and went on with her week, telling herself it wasn't worth raising with the district over what was probably nothing more than a typo. 2 weeks later, almost exactly matching the date in that strange entry, a washed-out access road cut off her scheduled handover, stranding her alone in the tower for the first week of what should have been a supervised transition period, with no way for relief to physically reach her until repair crews cleared the road. She'd have to complete that first week entirely on her own, without the usual overlap of an outgoing lookout showing her the ropes. On the exact night the binder's strange entry had described, she found herself alone in the tower after dark, with a radio that had started producing intermittent static earlier that evening for no clear reason. She thought about the entry. She thought about Sarah's brief mention of the binder being worth reading. She made a decision, alone, with nobody to consult, that felt right even though she couldn't fully explain why. She turned off every light in the tower, kept the radio nearby, but didn't attempt to call in anything unusual, and simply waited, watching the dark tree line below through the window without recording a single word about what she saw. She never described afterward, to anyone, exactly what appeared at the tree line that night. She kept that detail to herself the same way Sarah had kept certain details out of her official reports the year before. What she did say, eventually, to the retired lookout who checked in on her by phone once the road cleared, was that she'd done the shift the right way, quiet, unlit, unresponsive, and that whatever had been out there had eventually gone still enough, or far enough, that she'd made it to dawn without needing to do anything more than wait. At sunrise, she opened the binder to log the night's events, the way protocol required, and found the page for that date already filled in. Not with her own writing, describing what had happened, but with a single line in handwriting she didn't recognize, giving only a time, nothing else. No description, no explanation. Just a specific hour, marking a moment sometime in the middle of that night, with nothing to indicate what had occurred at that time or why it had been recorded at all. She left it exactly as she found it and finished her season without incident, though the district, sometime the following year, quietly changed staffing policy for that particular tower, moving to two-person rotations going forward and citing vague concerns about morale and safety in isolated single lookout postings, without specifying any incident that had prompted the change. Priya requested never to work that tower again after her season ended, and colleagues who asked her about it noted only that she never explained why, saying just that she'd done the shift right, and leaving it at that. The old binder itself was eventually retired from active use and boxed up for archival storage a few years later, replaced by a newer logbook better suited to current record-keeping standards. Nobody thought to remove the blank page with its single unexplained time notation before the binder went into storage, and as far as anyone knows, it's still there now, sitting in a box somewhere in a district records room, waiting for nobody in particular to find it again. The last two accounts are the ones people near that stretch of the trail still don't like to discuss, and they both circle back to where this collection started. The archivist who eventually pulled this whole collection together didn't set out looking for any of it. That part matters, because everything that follows started as ordinary hobbyist work, the kind of quiet, methodical project that fills a person's evenings without any expectation of where it might lead. For several years, they'd been collecting old shelter logbooks for a small hiking club's history project, cataloging decommissioned registers donated by hostels, ranger stations, and private landowners along the corridor, digitizing pages that would otherwise rot away in cardboard boxes nobody else wanted to deal with. It was careful, unglamorous work. Scanning brittle pages, cross-referencing dates against known hiker registries where such records existed, organizing decades of handwritten entries into something searchable for future researchers or curious hikers wanting to trace the trail's history. The archivist approached it the way anyone approaches an archival project, methodically, skeptically, without much patience for anything that smelled like exaggeration or ghost story dressed up as documentation. One particular donation arrived from a hostel that had recently changed ownership, a box of old registers the new owners didn't want cluttering up their storage space. Buried among pages of routine hiker entries, thanks for the pancakes, watch the mouse in bunk 3, was a single page that had clearly been removed from its original binding at some point and later reinserted. The kind of thing an archivist notices immediately, because pages that come loose and get reattached always show slightly different wear than pages that have stayed in place the whole time. The entry on that page described a knocking pattern in a shelter and a name written in a hand the archivist recognized, having spent enough hours by then studying handwriting samples across the whole collection. It matched, stroke for stroke, an entry from an entirely different logbook, a shelter register from a different section of trail, donated by a completely separate source, describing a completely different hiker's account of a knock against a support beam and a voice using a trail name. That kind of overlap wasn't supposed to be possible. These were two different physical books, from two different locations, donated independently by people who had no known connection to each other. And yet the handwriting matched closely enough that, side by side, They looked like they'd been written by the same hand. The archivist's first instinct was reasonable enough. A hoax, maybe. Some kind of shared joke passed between hikers who'd agreed to write similar entries in different shelters as a prank, or a well-known trail prankster with a habit of leaving fake entries in registers up and down the corridor. That explanation held together for about as long as it took to pull a third sample for comparison. An entry from the fire tower's old binder, describing a stillness at a tree line, in language that echoed both previous entries closely enough that it couldn't reasonably be coincidence. All three written in matching handwriting despite coming from three entirely unconnected sources. Over the following weeks, cross-referencing dates rather than just handwriting, the archivist began noticing something else. Something that took considerably longer to piece together because it required comparing entries across the entire collection, rather than just a handful of matching samples. Every one of these anomalous entries, the shelter register, the hostel guest book, the fire tower binder, and eventually others the archivist found scattered through different donated boxes, had been logged on the exact same calendar date, year after year, spanning back further than any single logbook in the collection could account for on its own. The date wasn't arbitrary. Checking it against historical weather records for the region, the archivist realized it consistently fell on the first hard frost of the season each year. Not a fixed calendar date, but a date determined by actual weather conditions, meaning whatever was responsible for these entries wasn't simply repeating on a set schedule. It was responding to something in the land itself, tracking a natural threshold that shifted slightly from year to year depending on when the cold finally settled in. The archivist sat with that realization for a long time, alone at a cluttered desk covered in scanned pages and a growing corkboard timeline connecting dates across decades. A desk lamp flickering slightly in a way that felt more like old wiring than anything worth reading into. Coffee had gone cold hours earlier without being noticed. The pattern, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Dozens of entries, from sources with no connection to each other, all converging on the same annual threshold, all written in handwriting that shifted just enough between samples to suggest different hands, yet matched closely enough within each cluster to suggest something closer to a single source working through many different pens. Checking the calendar against current weather forecasts for the region, the archivist realized the first hard frost of this season was expected within 2 days. The archivist didn't sleep well that night, and by morning had made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an obligation the research itself demanded. Drive out to the nearest active shelter along that stretch of a corridor and check the current register in person before the frost date arrived, rather than simply waiting to see what might turn up in some future donation months or years down the line. If the pattern held on a schedule tied to actual weather rather than a fixed calendar date, there was a chance, however uncomfortable to consider seriously, of seeing something happen in something closer to real time. The drive out took most of the morning, winding through the same general stretch of mountain roads that had shown up, in one form or another, throughout every account the archivist had spent the past several months piecing together. Arriving at the shelter, a modest lean-to not far off a road crossing, the archivist found the register in its usual spot, tucked into a gallon Ziploc wedged against the support beam, and flipped through it, looking for anything unusual. The current page, dated for that exact day, 2 days ahead of the frost the forecast had predicted, was already signed. Not with a name the archivist recognized from any recent hiker registry. The handwriting matched their own, not similar. Matched in the specific way the archivist had spent months learning to recognize across dozens of samples. Matched down to a particular way of crossing a T that the archivist had always assumed was too personal a habit to belong to anyone else. They stood there a long moment in the quiet of the shelter, the kind of stillness that settles over a person when something they'd been researching from a safe, Academic distance suddenly closes the distance on its own. The entry didn't say much. A date. A brief, unremarkable note about weather. Nothing that would look strange to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at. Before heading back to the vehicle, the archivist made one more stop. A meeting arranged the day before with a retired ridge runner who'd worked that section decades earlier and had, through a chain of contacts stretching back through several of the accounts already collected, agreed to talk. The man was elderly now, careful with his words, the kind of person who'd clearly decided long ago exactly how much of this he was willing to say out loud and had never found a reason to say more. He gave the clearest warning of the entire collection, delivered plainly, without embellishment. Don't read the entries out loud. Don't write your real name anywhere near a register on the frost date. And whatever happens, don't be anywhere on the trail overnight when the frost actually falls. The archivist asked him how he knew all this, how long he'd known, whether he'd ever tried to explain any of it to the district or to anyone with the authority to do something about it. He shook his head slowly and said some things had been going on longer than any district's records could account for, long enough that the smart approach had never been explanation. It had always just been the rule, passed down quietly from one person who'd learned it the hard way to the next person who needed to hear it before they did too. The archivist thanked him and left, intending to be well clear of the corridor before nightfall. But a storm system moved in faster and harder than the forecast had suggested. The same kind of early, heavy weather that had stranded more than one person in this collection, exactly when they needed clear roads the most. By the time the archivist reached the small rental cabin booked for the night, close enough to the corridor to be convenient for the research, far enough to feel like a reasonable buffer from whatever the frost date might bring, the access road out was already closing behind them, storm damage cutting off any option to drive out again before morning. Alone in the cabin that evening, surrounded by boxes of digitized logbooks brought along for the trip, the archivist tried to focus on ordinary work, cross-referencing a few remaining samples, keeping busy the way people in every account in this collection had tried to keep busy when the isolation started pressing in. Sometime after dark, faintly through the cabin wall, came a knocking. 3 beats, evenly spaced, the exact same rhythm described in the hostel guestbook entry from months earlier in the research. The same pattern Ledger had lain awake listening to in that back room. The same pattern Renee had heard carrying from her grandfather's barn through the rain. The archivist sat very still, listening, comparing the sound against the memory of every written account that had described it, and reached for nothing. No phone, useless out here anyway, no light switch, no attempt to knock back or call out or investigate. Just stillness and listening, the way every warning in this whole collection had eventually pointed toward. The knocking stopped the instant the archivist stopped moving to listen for it, exactly as it always had in every account before this one. But this time, having spent months learning just how deliberately these patterns behaved across every story in the collection, it no longer felt like a coincidence that it stopped exactly when someone held still enough to notice. It felt, for the first time in all this research, less like something reacting to silence, and more like something confirming that it had been heard. Comparing the timestamps later that night against historical records the archivist had gathered over the course of the project, it became clear that these frost date entries had been appearing in registers along this exact stretch of a corridor for far longer than any hiking club, any ranger district, or any official trail organization had existed, predating, according to the oldest sources available, even the earliest official construction of the trail itself through this section of mountains. The storm didn't let up through the night, snow mixing into the rain as the temperature dropped. Exactly the kind of conditions that would bring the season's first hard frost by morning. The archivist stayed up working through the boxes of donated logbooks, telling themselves it was simply making good use of otherwise wasted time. Though the truth, sitting there in a cabin with no way out until the roads cleared, was closer to needing something to occupy the hours before whatever midnight might bring. The current shelter register, the one signed already in the archivist's own handwriting for a day that hadn't fully happened yet, sat on the cabin's small table where it had been placed after the drive back from the shelter earlier that day. Every warning collected over months of research pointed the same direction. Don't read the entries out loud. Don't write a real name near a register on the frost date. Don't be anywhere on the trail overnight when the frost actually fell. The archivist wasn't on the trail itself, technically, tucked away instead in a rental cabin a mile off the corridor. That distinction felt at the time like it might matter. It felt like enough of a boundary to hold on to. At the stroke of midnight, against every instruction gathered across 9 separate accounts, the archivist opened the register anyway. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was closer to the same compulsion that had driven the entire project from the beginning. A researcher's need to see the thing directly, rather than only through secondhand description. A need that had been building for months and had finally arrived at a moment too significant to let pass unexamined. The book fell open easily to the current page, the one already signed earlier that day. Beneath that entry, in the exact same handwriting, was a new line that hadn't been there that afternoon. It described the cabin, described the storm, described the archivist sitting at this exact table at this exact hour, opening this exact register, the sentence trailing off mid-word, unfinished, as if whatever had been writing it had been interrupted in the act of writing about the very moment now unfolding. The archivist closed the book immediately, turned off every light in the cabin, and sat in the dark without moving. The same choice every account in this collection had eventually arrived at. Stillness over investigation, silence over answering, waiting over confronting. Outside, faintly, the same 3-beat knocking began again, this time seeming to come from somewhere near the cabin's back wall rather than through it, close enough that it felt less like a sound passing through a structure and more like something standing directly against the outside of it. The archivist didn't move, didn't call out, didn't turn a light back on to check. Every instinct screamed to look, to confirm, to do something other than sit in the dark with a book that had apparently been mid-sentence about this exact moment when it was closed. But every warning gathered over months of research pointed the same direction, and for the first time, the archivist trusted that pattern more than the impulse to verify it firsthand. The knocking continued at slow, uneven intervals for what felt like hours, never escalating, never approaching any closer than that first contact against the back wall, simply persisting through the dark hours of the storm the way it always seemed to in every account before this one. At some point before dawn, it stopped on its own, all at once, without any prompting, the same way it had stopped for every witness in this collection who had chosen not to answer it. By the time gray light began coming through the cabin's frosted windows, the first hard frost of the season finally settled over the ground outside, exactly as forecast. The archivist opened the register one more time, needing to see what remained of the entry that had been interrupted mid-sentence at midnight. The page was blank. No unfinished sentence. No description of the cabin, the storm, the sitting in the dark. Just a single timestamp marking the exact moment the archivist had closed the book the night before, with nothing else written around it, as if everything that had appeared there in the hours before had simply been erased once the moment it described had passed. The archivist finished cataloging the remaining boxes over the following weeks, completing the project largely as originally intended, but made one significant change to how the work was ultimately handled. Rather than including the frost date entries in the open, publicly accessible portion of the hiking club's archive, they were quietly set aside into a separate, restricted collection, available only by special request, with no public description beyond a brief, deliberately vague note explaining their existence. The archivist still checks that section's current registers every year, always around the same time, always tracking the same weather threshold that determines exactly when the first hard frost will settle over that stretch of corridor. But it has never again been after dark. Months passed after that night in the cabin. The project largely wound down. The archive quietly filed away in its restricted section where only a handful of trusted researchers would ever think to request access. The archivist had mostly returned to ordinary life, checking in on the collection occasionally, keeping the annual frost date habit alive without any particular expectation that the pattern would surface again in any new or unexpected way. That changed when an unmarked box arrived one afternoon, dropped off anonymously at the hiking club's small office with no return address, no note explaining who had sent it or why. Inside, among a handful of unremarkable items, was a printed sheet from a digital trail register, the kind some shelters and hostels had recently started using instead of physical logbooks, an app-based system that hikers signed electronically at kiosks near popular trailheads, meant to modernize record-keeping and make search and rescue coordination easier in an emergency. The printout showed a standard log of recent digital sign-ins, mostly unremarkable entries, trail names, dates, brief notes about trail conditions. Buried among them, dated for that year's frost date, was an entry that hadn't come from any registered user account. It described, in the same careful, familiar phrasing the archivist had spent months cataloging across dozens of physical logbooks, a brief note about weather conditions and a name that matched no hiker on file, appearing in a system that hadn't existed when this entire pattern first started showing up in handwritten pages decades, if not longer, earlier. The archivist sat with that printout for a long time, understanding, finally, something that months of research into old paper and old handwriting hadn't quite prepared them for. Whatever had been leaving these entries hadn't been limited to paper and pen the whole time. It had adapted, without apparent difficulty, to a format that hadn't existed when the pattern began, appearing in a digital system with the same patient, unexplained consistency it had shown in every physical register going back generations. The hiking club's official records, updated to reflect the growing collection of anomalous entries, eventually settled on a single, deliberately careful line to describe the phenomenon for anyone with restricted access who came looking. An ongoing, unexplained regional pattern, cause undetermined. The archivist had insisted on that specific phrasing, resisting pressure from a few board members who wanted either a firmer explanation or the whole thing removed from the record entirely. Vague felt more honest than either option. Vague left room for whatever this actually was to remain exactly as unresolved as it had always been. These days, the archivist still does occasional outreach work with new trail maintainers coming into the district. The kind of quiet, informal conversation that happens over coffee rather than in any official training session. When the subject comes up naturally, usually late in a conversation, after some trust is built between two people who both spend time on that stretch of corridor, the archivist offers the same handful of warnings that showed up, in one form or another, throughout every account in this entire collection. Don't answer if something calls your name from the trees. Don't sign a register after dark. Don't stay still too long on certain balds. Don't hunt certain ridges alone once the leaves drop. Don't ask too many questions about who cleared a blowdown you didn't expect to already be cleared. The archivist has never fully connected, out loud, to any of these new maintainers. how closely their own private warnings echo the exact wording used by a shuttle mechanic, an old ridge runner, a hostel owner, and a handful of others scattered throughout years of collected accounts. People who never knew each other, who worked different sections of the same corridor decades apart, who each arrived independently at nearly identical instructions for surviving something none of them could name. Back in the archivist's office, on a corkboard timeline that still hangs on the wall above the desk, this year's frost date sits circled in red marker, one line among dozens stretching back across the collection. Beside it, in handwriting, the archivist does not remember adding, "Next year's date is already marked." The trail keeps its own records on its own schedule, and somewhere between a gap with no wind and a register nobody quite remembers signing, it is still keeping them.